Dopamine is the molecule responsible for driving motivation and the desire to take action toward your goals. But increasing dopamine is not always the answer to achieving long-term, sustainable motivation that results in progressively achieving goals and enjoying the achievement of those goals. In this video, we will share the tools to implement what Andrew Huberman calls dopamine scheduling, meaning how to leverage your dopamine to achieve sustaining motivation that leads to long-term success and joy. Dr. Andrew Huberman is a neurobiology professor at Stanford School of Medicine. He teaches that the way you're leading your life and conceptualizing your goals actually determines whether you will stay motivated to pursue and succeed in achieving those goals. He demystifies dopamine, explaining the fundamental relationship between the release of dopamine and motivation and the connection between dopamine and pain. What is dopamine? Dopamine is responsible for wanting, craving, and narrowing our focus for the things we desire. Dopamine is mainly released in anticipation and craving for a particular thing, and is fundamental in our desire to engage in action. The molecule dopamine is responsible for our sense of motivation and movement. It makes us pursue and create new things. We are largely taught that dopamine is about pleasure and reward, but dopamine can be more accurately defined as the buildup and motivation leading up to the reward. The ventral tegmental area, or VTA, is located deep in the brain and sends dopamine to another structure called the nucleus accumbens. The VTA and nucleus accumbens together are known as the reward pathway. They are responsible for driving the motivation behind every action. The prefrontal cortex, located behind the forehead, works in tandem with the reward pathway and controls when dopamine is released and how much is released. Huberman explains that the prefrontal cortex acts as a brake on the reward pathway. Without the regulation of the prefrontal cortex, we would be purely pleasure-seeking, unable to function and meet our most basic needs with the sole focus of constantly seeking more pleasure. Brain circuitry evolved in this way in order to motivate behaviors toward particular goals, such as finding and drinking water when we're thirsty, and reproducing in order to continue the human species. How does motivation work? Motivation is a two-part process, balancing pleasure and pain. When you anticipate something you desire, a small amount of dopamine is released, such as when you're thinking about your latte as you're waiting in line at the coffee shop. When you reach that thing, or take the first sip of your latte, more dopamine is released. To get an idea of how dopamine levels shift, when eating your favorite meal, dopamine levels go up about 50% above baseline. Caffeine increases dopamine about 30% above baseline. Sex increases dopamine release around 100%. Nicotine increases dopamine around 150%, while cocaine and amphetamines can increase dopamine 1000%. Just thinking about these behaviors and substances can increase the amount of dopamine that is released, to the same degree as actually consuming or partaking in those things. What is the relationship between pleasure and pain?
And the way that motivation works generally in the non-addictive setting is that when you anticipate something, a little bit of dopamine is released, and then when you reach that thing, you engage in that thing, the amount of dopamine goes up even further. But as you repeatedly pursue a behavior and you repeatedly engage with a particular thing, let's say you love running or you love chocolate, as you eat a piece of chocolate, believe it or not, it tastes good, and then there's a shift away from activation of dopamine, and there are other chemicals that are released that trigger a low-level sense of pain.
When you repeatedly pursue and engage in a behavior, such as your morning coffee or your daily run, as you engage in that behavior or substance, there's a shift away from the activation of dopamine. Other chemicals released to elicit a low-level sense of pain. This pain is not necessarily physical, but psychological pain or the craving for more. Enveloped in your first sip of coffee is the enjoyment and rush of dopamine, blended with the instant craving for more coffee. Dr. Huberman explains that pain or craving is woven into every moment of pleasure. He suggests paying attention the next time you taste something delicious. You will most likely notice that you are not only immersed in the pleasure of the taste, but you are already wanting that second bite, the second sip. He says that the wanting for more is the pain system in action. Part of our enjoyment is always the anticipation and craving for more.
With each subsequent time that you encounter that thing, that you pursue the chocolate, that you pursue the lover, each time the experience of dopamine release and pleasure is diminished a little bit. And the diabolical thing is that the pain response is increased a little bit.
More importantly, As we continue to pursue a goal or behavior, such as a financial goal or a morning latte, the level of dopamine released in the brain diminishes over time, while our level of craving or psychological pain increases. This means that although our craving for that goal or thing increases over time, our pleasure, dopamine release, and enjoyment decreases. Dr. Huberman explains that much of our pursuit of pleasure is motivated by the desire to reduce the pain of craving. Although the pain that we are speaking of is psychological pain, Huberman says that people can also experience this craving or pain physically. People who miss their loved one or partner, or are experiencing the craving of an addictive substance, can especially experience this pain physically. The prefrontal cortex's regulation of dopamine is an extremely important part of human evolution. Our brain circuitry has evolved in this way so that we are not purely seeking pleasure and continue to reach our goals and meet our needs. Our capacity to experience pain also affects our ability to experience pleasure. For example, after an ice bath, which is usually described as painful during the experience, dopamine release increases for the next 2.5 hours to around 250% above baseline. The cold exposure is not what increases dopamine, but rather invokes dopamine release after the pain is over. Let's dig into how to increase dopamine naturally and optimize success and motivation through dopamine reward scheduling. Avoid viewing bright light during the night. Viewing bright light from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. suppresses the activation of the reward circuitry in the brain, not only in those moments, but to all things you normally participate in and would otherwise feel a sense of reward from. This reduces your capacity to release dopamine. Getting proper sleep and having a healthy sleep cycle is imperative to healthy dopamine levels. Spending time in sunlight triggers the release of both dopamine and serotonin. Mindfulness, meditation, and breathwork have also been shown to naturally increase dopamine levels, especially when practiced consistently. For some, supplements may be helpful in improving dopamine release. L-tyrosine, which is present in red meats and certain nuts, is a precursor for dopamine. It is an amino acid partially responsible for the production of several neurotransmitters, including epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. You can consume foods rich in L-tyrosine or take it as a supplement, though it is important to note that while supplements increase motivation and dopamine levels in the short term, supplementing is usually followed by a dopamine crash. Be sure to consult with a doctor to discuss which supplements would be best for your body. There are biological factors that inhibit some individuals from releasing enough dopamine. It is important for these individuals to consult with a psychiatrist or doctor. After consulting with a professional, you may choose to work with supplements such as mucuna pruriens, which is 99.9% L-dopa, a precursor to dopamine. Certain antidepressants are known to increase dopamine and epinephrine. Dr. Huberman reminds us that big spikes in dopamine, whether they come from supplements or pharmaceuticals, will always make us want more dopamine. If we increase our dopamine release, not only will we require more and more of the substances we use to increase our dopamine, but we will also incrementally increase our psychological pain or craving. We don't necessarily always want to increase our dopamine levels to increase our motivation, joy, and success. And here's why. Motivation is fundamental to daily life. It's what makes us get out of bed in the morning, as well as pursue long-term goals. To achieve lasting motivation and the ability to consistently pursue and achieve new goals and enjoy the journey of process, we must leverage our dopamine scheduling. Huberman explains that individuals who are most successful are those who create their own internal buffers. Buffers can involve taking a break from the things we love as well as dopamine scheduling, meaning intermittently removing rewards subjectively. In doing so, we improve our ability to stay motivated, as well as enjoy the process and each milestone along the way.
As you are staircasing toward your goal, maybe that's dollars, maybe that's followers, maybe that's grades, maybe that's some other metric, it's medals or trophies, you actually want to blunt the reward response for some of those intermediate goals. Now, I'm not telling you shouldn't celebrate your wins, but I'm telling you not to celebrate all of them. Or as a good friend of mine who, fortunately for him, had a great financial success, he asked me and somebody else, a good friend of mine who's very tuned into dopamine reward schedules, understands how they work at a really deep level. And he said, I don't know what to do next. And we said, oh, well, that's simple. You should just give most of it away. And this wasn't a ploy to receive any of the money ourselves. This was really about reducing the impact of that reward.
The key is to randomly remove the reward, rather than removing it in a predictable pattern. Perhaps celebrating your wins looks like treating yourself to a nice dinner, or sharing with others about your success when you've reached a milestone. Subjectively removing the reward could look like randomly keeping your success private, or not going out to the celebratory dinner. Or perhaps you celebrate, but not as intensely. This allows you to keep your dopamine system in check and in the pursuit of the next milestones. Many people who achieve a huge goal or accomplishment immediately think, "Now what?" It's important for high achievers and highly motivated individuals to engage in practices and behaviors that bring them into the present moment. These practices can include creating a healthy sleep schedule, practicing mindfulness, and regulating the nervous system. These practices offset the pain-pleasure mechanism and allow the individual to enjoy the pleasure of the present moment and feel calm and happy. High achievers and highly motivated individuals can also be prone to addiction, not only substance addiction, but behavioral addiction, such as constantly achieving or performing. It is not healthy or effective to always be achieving. We can reach our long-term goals more effectively by having downtime or recovery periods. It's important to have self-regulating skills so that you can actually enjoy the life you're living and not just be living for the next success and achievement. We've talked about pleasure in the pursuit of our goals, but pleasure is also the joy in what you have right now. Remember that psychological pain is a normal part of achieving goals and a normal part of life. If we can continue to experience pain and friction and effort in tandem with pleasure and reward, then the rewards are that much greater and more sustaining. Here are 5 key points to remember to optimize your motivation for the long game. 1. Dopamine is not the reward. It is the motivation toward the reward. 2. Increase dopamine naturally through healthy sleep, mindfulness, and sunlight. 3. Supplements can naturally increase dopamine levels. But remember that big influxes in dopamine will result in a dopamine crash, as well as an increase in craving. 4. To increase your dopamine threshold with longevity, celebrate your wins, but don't celebrate every win. 5. For high achievers, learn how to self-regulate and be present. To be constantly looking for the next achievement means you will never be able to enjoy those achievements, or enjoy what you have now. Create sustaining practices that support your long-term health and emotional well-being.